My name is Lysandra Croft. I am 32, and the evening my father labeled me a worthless delinquent, I didn't shed a tear, beg for his understanding, or bother defending myself. I just remained standing at the far edge of his dining table while the rest of the room went completely still, watching him hurl insults at me like I was some sort of disease he needed to eradicate from his pristine life. He called me a parasite. He sneered that my bank account didn't buy class. He pointed at the door and told me to get out of his sight. The absolute madness of that moment, I had spent the last decade quietly funding the bailouts for crises they never even realized I had covered. By that Tuesday, I had built a logistics empire worth $34 million. But standing in that stuffy dining room, none of the math mattered. In their eyes, I was still the reckless girl who abandoned university, tore up the family's golden playbook, and chose a path they couldn't micromanage. So I looked straight into his furious eyes and said, "All right, done." I grabbed my coat and walked out into the rain. I never raised my voice. I was down the driveway before anyone even found the nerve to blink. Before the sun came up, I had my apartment packed, my phone tossed into a drawer, and I drove out of Seattle without looking back. A month later, those same people who sat silently while I was thrown out would be drowning in the reality they had.
I was raised in a Seattle suburb where your worth was measured by how good your resume looked to the neighbors. My father, Arthur Croft, was a senior corporate auditor who stayed at the same rigid firm for 40 years. He wore that stagnation like a badge of absolute moral purity. My mother, Beatrice, was an archivist. She had a gentle tone, but enforced his suffocating rules with a polite, unbreakable smile. My older brother, Julian, clung to the established path like a drowning man to a raft. My sister Cecilia figured out early exactly how to flatter the right authorities to get whatever she wanted. Then there was me. I was the glitch in their perfect system. At 10 years old, I wasn't playing with dolls. I was dragging discarded wooden chairs out of alleys, sanding them down in our driveway, and selling them to neighbors. I wrote little index cards detailing the history of the wood, making a scuffed table sound like a vintage treasure. At 13, I was showing local farmers how to take decent photos of their produce to sell subscription boxes online. By 16, I was coding custom inventory platforms for independent jewelers and leatherworkers at the weekend markets. I was obsessed with the mechanics of human desire, why a good story commanded a higher price than a list of raw materials, and how presentation totally changed perceived value. My father treated my obsession like a cute, mildly annoying phase. He'd stand by the sink, nursing his coffee, and remind me that tinkering without a degree was just a fast track to poverty. My mother echoed him, claiming they just wanted me to be safe. What they actually wanted was compliance. When Julian landed a law clerkship, they bought.
I dragged myself to the local university just because fighting their expectations took more energy than I had left. I survived a year and a half. Sitting in those lecture halls felt like watching someone read a manual about swimming while I was already drowning in the ocean. The professors discussed market risks as abstract concepts on whiteboards. I was already bleeding money and making it back. They read from textbooks about buyer behavior. I already knew that mothers bought custom woodwork on Thursday evenings out of exhaustion, not on Sunday mornings with cash in hand. I wasn't avoiding hard work. I was just in the wrong room. But under my parents' roof, quitting meant you were a failure. No exceptions. The afternoon I confessed I was dropping out, my father stared at me like I was a criminal wasting his valuable time. He didn't bother asking what my actual business plan was. He just demanded to know how much shame I planned to drag into his social circle. He accused me of choosing chaos out of sheer arrogance. He told me nobody with real influence would ever write a check to a runaway student. My mother wept, terrified of what her book club would say. Julian smirked and shook his head. Cecilia accused me of playing the victim to get attention. I packed my bags anyway. I rented a damp, windowless studio above a bakery on the wrong side of town. I worked until my eyes blurred. I memorized tax codes, supply chain bottlenecks, vendor negotiations, and the sheer terror of dealing with angry suppliers at 3 in the morning. You know what stung the worst? The money wasn't the hard part. It was the crushing realization that my blood relatives would rather watch me fail doing things their way than succeed doing something they couldn't comprehend. Have you ever realized the people who claim they want the best for you actually just want you to stay small so they feel comfortable?
The empire that ultimately bought my freedom didn't start as a brilliant, polished concept. It was born from watching incredible artisans go bankrupt. They made gorgeous things, but had zero grasp of shipping logistics, profit margins, or how to grow without burning out. I spent my early 20s surviving on black coffee, arguing with freight drivers, building sets in my tiny apartment to shoot product photos, and sleeping on stacks of cardboard boxes because I couldn't afford a real storage unit. Everything shifted when I met Margot Dupree at a wholesale convention in Portland. I was 23 and sweating through my cheap blazer. Margot had spent decades sourcing for massive global retailers. Within 15 minutes of talking to me, she recognized the exact fire my family had spent years trying to extinguish. I wasn't a mess. I was a visionary. I was early. Margot forced me to stop playing small. Together, we built a supply chain and e-commerce infrastructure firm tailored entirely for independent creators. We gave potters, organic farmers, and textile weavers the same distribution power as massive corporations, without losing their souls to big marketplaces. I built the software, designed the fulfillment protocols, and managed the brand partnerships. I wasn't just peddling junk. I was constructing an entire economy. It almost destroyed me a dozen times anyway. I drained my savings to zero and clawed it back over 9 terrifying months. A warehouse flood wiped out half my inventory during the holiday rush. I spent an entire February wearing 2 coats inside my apartment because I chose paying my staff over my heating bill. But I survived. Every disaster was an education. Even with that kind of wealth, I kept my mouth shut around my family. I convinced myself I was preserving our dynamic, but the reality was much sadder. I was still that little girl hoping they would validate me before the money forced them to. So I shrank myself down every time I sat at their table. When my mother's dental surgery hit a massive snag and insurance vanished, an anonymous grant covered the out-of-pocket costs overnight. When Julian's mortgage underwriter demanded more cash to close on his house, a generous colleague magically wired the exact difference. When Cecilia's destination wedding faced cancellation due to a sudden hike in venue fees, the debt was wiped clean before she even shed a tear. My father would literally brag about providing for his flock while driving a sedan I had quietly paid the mechanic to overhaul. I swallowed that bitter pill daily. I would solve their financial disasters before lunch and sit there at dinner listening to them use my life as a cautionary tale for the cousins. The ultimate betrayal happened when Julian decided he wanted to launch a consulting firm for real estate developers. I offered to map out his client acquisition strategy and build his automated marketing funnels. He just laughed in my face, looked me up and down, and said he wasn't about to take corporate strategy from a Everything finally imploded at my father's 65th birthday dinner. I made the tragic mistake of believing that absolute, undeniable proof would finally alter how they saw me. I showed up to the restaurant carrying a gift I had spent half a year orchestrating. It wasn't a flashy sports car or a tacky watch. It was a comprehensive, bulletproof trust fund managed by my private wealth team. It was designed to ensure my parents would never have to worry about a medical bill, a mortgage payment, or inflation ever again.
I walked in carrying this ridiculous, fragile hope. I truly believed that if I laid out the reality of my life, without screaming, without drama, they would finally look at the woman I had become, instead of the rebellious teenager they despised. The evening began with the usual toxic normalcy that makes you question your own sanity. My mother fussed nervously over the wine glasses. Cecilia dominated the conversation with stories about her PR firm's latest glamorous client. Julian aggressively dropped financial buzzwords into the chat to remind everyone how important his job was. And my father sat at the center of it all, soaking up the blind reverence he demanded from his children. For 2 hours, nobody asked me a single genuine question. I tried to explain it as gently as I could. I told them my logistics firm had just cleared a massive valuation hurdle, and I had set up this portfolio to make sure they were entirely insulated from the world. I told them I did it because I cared about them. The dining room went completely silent. Julian broke it with a sharp, ugly laugh. He leaned back in his chair and asked if this was some internet scam money, the kind where people rent sports cars for Instagram. Cecilia groaned and told me to stop trying to turn our father's birthday into a PR stunt for my little brand. My father just stared at the legal pages, like they were an insult to his dignity. His voice was thin and laced with disgust when he finally spoke. He asked if I honestly believed that tossing cash on his table suddenly put me on the same level as people who had built respectable, educated lives. I kept my voice level. I told him it had nothing to do with being equal. It was about taking care of the people I loved. I admitted I had been doing it quietly for years because I never wanted them to feel embarrassed. That was the match in the powder barrel. My mother blinked, completely lost. Julian's face drained of color before flushing dark red. Cecilia slammed her hand on the table and demanded to know what the hell I was talking about. I should have just walked away right then. But maybe I was just exhausted from being the family ghost. Maybe a decade of swallowing their sneers finally caught up to me. So I told them. Not every single wire transfer, but enough to shatter the illusion. I told them about paying the balance of Mom's dental surgery. My father shot up from his chair so violently it screeched against the hardwood. He didn't look relieved or grateful. He looked like an animal backed into a corner. That was the exact second I realized some people will happily label you a monster rather than admit they couldn't survive without you. Julian practically spit at me, asking if I thought he was some pathetic charity case. Cecilia called me a manipulative narcissist for holding debts over their heads in secret. My mother just started sobbing, asking why I would hide such things, as if the reason wasn't standing at the head of the table red in the face. Then my father erupted. He screamed that I had walked into his dining room to buy his authority. He told me that dirty money printed by a college dropout would never mean anything in his house. He yelled that I had absolutely no right to humiliate people with real degrees and real careers. Julian jumped in. Then Cecilia. They formed a choir of mockery, laughing at my little craft project, tearing down my lack of formal credentials. They acted like my company, which paid salaries to dozens of people and kept hundreds of independent creators afloat, was just a crude joke that embarrassed the family name. I didn't raise my voice. That quietness seemed to drive my father absolutely insane. He pointed a trembling finger at the front door. "You are nothing but a delinquent with a lucky streak," he snarled. And then, turning up the volume so the neighbors could hear, he shouted, "Get out of my house, you worthless parasite!"
I didn't give a speech. I didn't shed a tear. I walked out into the damp Seattle night. I sat in my car at the end of the driveway for 2 full minutes. I didn't turn the key. I just stared out the windshield, feeling a sensation wash over me that wasn't heartbreak at all. It was cold, clean, and absolute. I wasn't broken. I was just finished.
By the time I merged onto the highway, the decision was concrete. I was done spending my life auditioning for the affection of people who only felt comfortable when I was beneath them. I drove straight to my apartment, packed my entire life into boxes before the sun came up, and dropped out of their existence. I deleted the family group chat, boxed up every childhood photograph, left my apartment keys on the counter, and drove south toward Carmel by the sea. I didn't leave a note. 3 weeks later, they would realize my silence wasn't a retreat. It was the sound of a deadbolt sliding shut. Carmel didn't magically fix me overnight. What it gave me was permission to stop acting. The year before, I had quietly purchased a cliffside cottage overlooking the Pacific, an investment I told myself I'd use when things slowed down. I showed up with my boxes, bone-deep exhaustion, and a quiet, elegant fury. My first week, I gutted the house of anything mass-produced. I stripped the walls, unpacked the gorgeous, imperfect ceramics and woven rugs I had bought from my own vendors over the years, and filled the rooms with things made by hands, not corporate machines. Then I did something incredibly petty and entirely necessary. I carried a box of old graduation cards and family birthday notes to the fire pit on the patio, lit a match, and watched them burn. I needed the physical proof that the old Lysandra was dead. I started sleeping 8 hours a night. Exactly 3 weeks after I walked out of that dining room, Julian showed up uninvited at my cottage door in Carmel. He wore the same arrogant smirk he used whenever he thought he could leverage his charm, but the skin around his eyes was tight with panic. He didn't even pretend to apologize. He went straight into the family script. He claimed our father was just stressed out, that birthdays make people act crazy, and that I was being overly sensitive. Then he smoothly shifted gears to the real reason he drove 12 hours down the coast. A commercial real estate venture had blown up in his face. He needed liquidity immediately. He framed it as a quick bridge loan, just a little favor between a brother and sister. I looked at him and asked if he drove all this way to make amends or to collect a check. He bristled instantly. He started throwing around words like loyalty, bloodlines, and history, the exact vocabulary people use when they want your money without any of the accountability. Before I even had to respond, my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was my director of finance. I had been negotiating a massive logistics contract all morning, so I put him on speaker. Julian stood there in my kitchen and listened as I confirmed the terms on an 8-figure fulfillment deal and authorized the wire for a massive warehouse expansion in Texas. I didn't step into the other room. I didn't mute the phone. I was done performing smallness for him. When I hung up, Julian was staring at me like I was an alien wearing his sister's skin. I told him no. Not maybe later. Just no. No bridge loan. I found out later that Julian drove straight back to Seattle and spilled everything. He told them about the coastal property, the massive contract he overheard, the sheer scale of the wealth I possessed. That miserable visit was the first time their delusion about me actually cracked. It was also the spark that burned their reputation to the ground. A month later, Carmel gave me the kind of visibility Seattle never allowed. A major West Coast business magazine ran a massive feature on my local workshops, the explosive growth of my logistics firm, and the rogue path I took to get there. The journalist was sharp. The piece was flattering, but entirely brutal. It explored how the most disruptive business minds are often treated like jokes by their own families, simply because they don't carry the right corporate pedigree. Without dropping any specific names, the article pointed out that family skepticism is often just sabotage disguised as concern, driven entirely by ego. The piece went viral. A massive entrepreneurship podcast read excerpts on air. An industry newsletter quoted a line I gave the interviewer. "The people who share your blood are rarely the ones who actually see your potential." Within 2 weeks, the article hit Seattle. Suddenly, people I hadn't spoken to since high school were reaching out. Extended relatives who used to ignore me at reunions were sharing the link, and my immediate family found themselves trapped in a public narrative they couldn't edit or control. The fallout destroyed their delicate social ecosystem. My father's auditing firm had recently launched a massive PR campaign about embracing alternative talent. After my interview circulated, junior partners started casually forwarding the article around the office, loudly praising the daughter who built an empire without a degree. Men who had endured my father's arrogant lectures on the necessity of formal education started asking him, with thinly veiled smiles, if he still thought college was the only way to avoid being a failure. My father reacted the way all fragile men do when their pride is punctured. He got aggressively loud. He screamed at a young associate during a board meeting for suggesting alternative hiring practices. He threw a tantrum in the executive lounge when someone brought up my podcast quote. Within 2 months, the firm quietly forced him into an early retirement package following a stress-induced episode. Everyone in Seattle knew it was just public humiliation wrapped in a severance check. Julian's karma was much more direct, and honestly, far more satisfying. He had been quietly name-dropping my company at his bank, implying to the senior partners that he managed my wealth and could bring in massive corporate accounts if they gave him a senior portfolio. Once the article dropped and it became glaringly obvious we despised each other, the bank's compliance officers audited his claims. He had vastly exaggerated his connections to my firm. He lost the promotion he was so desperate for and was officially reprimanded for falsifying client relationships. That gossip tore through the Seattle banking scene faster than a wildfire. Julian's downfall within our extended social circle was incredibly swift. The uncles, cousins, and family friends who used to worship the ground he walked on suddenly sent his calls straight to voicemail. He had promised them insider investment deals and corporate access he couldn't actually deliver, and the embarrassment of being caught in that lie stripped away his golden boy armor overnight. Cecilia, however, did something that genuinely shocked me. She took the first actual step toward adulthood out of all of them. She sent me an audio message late one Tuesday night. It wasn't a curated PR statement. It wasn't a half-baked apology layered with defensive excuses. I could hear her breathing heavily, the sound of passing traffic in the background suggesting she was hiding out in her car. "I knew Dad was completely out of line that night," she whispered, her voice cracking. I kept my mouth shut because I was terrified he would turn that rage on me next. I am so deeply ashamed of that. You deserved a sister in that room, and I just sat there like a coward. I played that recording 4 times in a row. Genuine sincerity had been completely out of line from my family dynamic for so long that I needed to examine it from every possible angle before I allowed myself to believe it. And then came the irony that felt almost too perfect to be real. The massive corporate auditing conglomerate where my father had spent his entire adult life was hosting a West Coast summit on the future of alternative commerce and supply chain logistics. A senior director there had read the magazine feature on my company. He emailed me directly, asking if I would deliver the closing keynote address. The proposed topic? Building empires outside the traditional framework. I stood in my kitchen in Carmel, staring at my laptop screen and laughed until my ribs ached. My father wouldn't just hear about my success secondhand anymore. He would be forced to sit in a velvet chair and watch the firm he worshipped applaud the exact daughter he had banished. That was when my mother started calling. Initially, her voicemails were soft and tentative. Then they grew frantic, arriving almost daily. She desperately wanted to smooth the concrete over the cracks. She claimed the family just needed to heal together. She made endless excuses, telling me Dad was just under an immense amount of pressure, that Julian was facing a crisis of confidence. that Cecilia missed having her sister around. She kept talking around the gaping wound. She never once addressed the actual cruelty. So I stopped listening. I blocked her number from ringing through and let the silence stretch out. Eventually, the text message came through. Your father knows he was entirely wrong. Not sorry, not devastated, just wrong. That specific word arrived years too late, but it finally arrived. I typed out my response without a second of hesitation. I told her there would be no quiet, rug-sweeping private dinners. I refused to sit around a table using soft voices and pretending the trauma was just a misunderstanding. I laid out a non-negotiable ultimatum. If any of them wanted the slightest relationship with me moving forward, they had to tell the truth plainly, brutally, and publicly. They had to confess to the extended family they had spent a decade lying.
The corporate summit took place in a massive, glass-walled convention center in downtown Seattle. Heavy vinyl banners bearing the logos of legacy financial institutions hung from the ceiling, looking like old men desperately reminding each other they still controlled the world. When I walked into the backstage green room, Cecilia was already waiting for me. She wore a sharp navy suit, but her posture was entirely defeated. She looked less certain of herself than I had ever seen her. She reached out to hug me, waiting for my slight nod of permission before leaning in, then quickly stepped back. She knew she hadn't earned the right to casual comfort yet. She caught me up on the wreckage. Julian was on the verge of being fired. My father had barely left his study since the firm pushed him into retirement. My mother had spent 3 agonizing weeks figuring out how to explain to her book clubs and our relatives that the narrative they had aggressively pushed about the delinquent daughter was a total fabrication. Then she pulled her phone from her pocket and handed it to me. You need to see this before you go out there, she said softly. The screen displayed a recorded Zoom call from 4 days prior. The grid was filled with the faces of my aunts, uncles, and older cousins, the exact audience that had quietly absorbed my parents' toxic stories for years. In the recording, my mother sat rigidly on her sofa and openly admitted they had judged me unfairly, minimized my massive achievements, and allowed pure ego to morph into abuse. Then the camera shifted to my father. He looked entirely hollowed out. His voice shook as he spoke the words I had once bled for. I handed the phone back to Cecilia and quietly thanked her for forcing them to face the firing squad without me in the room to absorb the bullets. That was the very first boundary I had established, and it was the first time they hadn't dared to cross it. When the stage manager signaled me, I walked out under the blinding spotlights. I spotted him immediately. Arthur Croft sat dead center in the front row. His shoulders were squared defensively, his face locked in the agonizing expression of a man trapped between crushing shame and his own stubborn pride. Julian sat next to my mother, looking physically smaller than I remembered. The world had finally stopped providing him with a cushion. The moderator introduced me as a visionary logistics founder, a supply chain strategist, and a leading voice for independent commerce. He read off statistics about my company's job creation, our market impact, and how we were entirely redefining credibility in the tech space. My father didn't clap initially, but the deafening applause from the executives surrounding him eventually forced his hands together. I stepped up to the acrylic podium and looked out over a sea of corporate operators, wealthy investors, and hungry students. I had written a very safe, polite speech on the flight over. I threw it out in the first 30 seconds. I told the crowd that raw talent rarely arrives holding the standard paperwork they demand. I explained how the most brilliant, capable minds in our industry are often discarded early simply because they refuse to follow a script dictated by few. I acknowledged that formal training and discipline are vital tools, but I also warned them that if those credentials become an excuse to strip dignity from people taking a different path, they are completely worthless. Then I delivered the line that sucked the air out of the room. A person's true value is established long before their resume crosses your desk. The ultimate test of your character is how you treat someone before you figure out what they can do for you.
I never broke eye contact with the back wall, but I didn't need to look at my father. The suffocating silence radiating from his seat answered for him. When I finished, the entire auditorium stood up. It wasn't because I had defeated my family, and it wasn't because revenge is somehow sweet. The applause happened because absolute truth, spoken clearly and without a shred of apology, carries a physical weight. It literally alters the temperature of a room. During the networking hour backstage, the senior director who invited me brought over a group of executives. With a politeness so sharp, it felt like an assassination. He turned to my father and smiled. "Arthur, you must be unbelievably proud of her." That was the exact moment my father shattered. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was pathetic. His rigid jaw went slack, and his eyes welled up. He pulled me into a quiet side corridor, away from the catered tables, but close enough that he couldn't hide. My mother trailed behind him. Cecilia stood guard by the door. Julian stayed entirely out of sight. He started with the pathetic, empty phrases people use when they realize they've lost. He claimed he was shocked, that the money intimidated him, that he didn't know how to process it. Then he stopped talking, realizing how...
Julian finally stepped into the hallway. His voice trembled as he confessed that he had built his entire fragile ego on feeling superior to me. When that delusion broke, he tried to leech off my wealth the same way he leeched off everything else. Cecilia apologized again, this time looking me straight in the eyes. My mother wept, admitting she had spent 4 decades enabling a tyrant just to keep the peace, and it cost her her youngest child. I listened to all of them. I believed the pain in their voices, but I didn't hand out any unearned forgiveness. I looked at my family and laid out the terms of my life. I told them the only connection I was willing to maintain would be built on brutal honesty, immense distance, and basic respect. I cut off all financial aid forever. Nobody would ever use my company's name for leverage again. There would be no unannounced visits to Carmel, and no gaslighting me about my own memories. Cecilia was allowed to call me. My mother could send text messages. Julian would need years of consistent therapy and behavioral change before I offered him anything beyond a polite nod. And my father? If he ever wanted to speak to me again, he would do it stripped of his authority. He would approach me without entitlement, and he would never again expect me to carry the weight of his guilt. He nodded slowly, looking like a man trying to breathe underwater. There was no sweeping cinematic hug, no magical erasure of a decade of abuse, just concrete consequences and a truth they couldn't bury anymore. I flew back to the California coast the very next morning. I went home, and for the first time, home meant a sanctuary I had built with my own hands, not a courtroom where my existence was constantly on trial.
A week later, I opened the doors of my Carmel loft for another strategy workshop. A dozen incredibly driven women walked in carrying fabric swatches, messy notebooks, deep anxieties, and massive ambitions. Fig, my half-blind rescue dog, snored quietly near the window, while I stood by the whiteboard. We tore down pricing models, mapped out sustainable growth, and discussed why carrying other people's shame is the single most expensive mistake an independent founder can make. I vastly expanded the quiet scholarship fund I had started a year prior, funneling serious capital to young women building enterprises outside the traditional university system. Cecilia eventually started donating her agency's PR hours to the girls in the program. Julian mailed me a handwritten letter. No demands, no excuses, just a quiet admission of his own failures. My mother sent a small package containing my childhood photo albums, accompanied by a heavy card that read, You were never the defect. My father writes to me occasionally. Short, carefully worded letters. There is no self-pity in them anymore. Just updates, accountability, and the painful, awkward effort of an old man realizing that unconditional love does not survive conditional respect. I reply when I feel like it. I ignore them when I don't. That power belongs entirely to me now. One evening, deep into October, I stood barefoot on the cedar deck of my cliffside house. The Pacific Ocean was churning wildly under the fading purple light. The air smelled like salt and burning firewood from a neighbor's chimney. I thought back to the girl standing at the edge of that dining room table, quietly saying, "All right, done." I walked away that night because engaging in a screaming match would have required shrinking myself to fit a room that was dedicated to misunderstanding me.
I used to believe that vengeance required inflicting the exact same agony on your abusers that they'd forced you to endure. I know better now. The most lethal form of revenge was simply holding the mirror steady until they were forced to look at their own hideous reflections. True vengeance was constructing a reality so undeniable and bulletproof that their opinions ceased to exist in my atmosphere. The ultimate victory was realizing that by the time they finally scrambled to acknowledge my worth, I had completely lost the need for their applause. I leaned against the wooden railing, listening to the crashing waves, and felt a profound, untouchable stillness. I didn't need my family to rescue me, validate my choices, or finally understand my mind. I had already completed the impossible work. I had chosen myself. So I have to ask, what happens to your life when you finally decide that your own sanity is worth more than bloodlines, forced loyalty, and the suffocating roles they assigned you to keep you manageable? Have you ever been mocked as a failure by the exact same people who were secretly feeding off your strength? Drop your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. A brief follow-up question for you. What specific element of Lysandra's journey resonated most with you? And would you like to explore more stories focused on breaking away from toxic family dynamics?